think it effectively prices people out of education. It creates a marketplace for education, which, generally marketplaces do create, ingenuity, innovation, helps create sort of better goods at lower prices. But when it comes to education, I don't think you can put a price tag on it in that way. By doing that, you price people out.
I personally believe that education is quite costly, and if you want to have a high standard of education, you sort of need different sources for money. For example, if you look to the States, where the education is pretty expensive, where you go for $30,000 a year, but they have the highest standard of education in the world. So I think a completely free system would be somehow not right. But I think that rising it to, for example, $30,000 or pounds, whatever, is definitely overpriced. And I see the system now with around £3,000 as a good middle wage.
I agree that there is a strong argument for more money, basically, in education, to keep standards high and to keep us in competition with other global competitors. And you can raise fees with that argument, but you can't then cut government funding at the same time. If you want more money, you can't bring it in from one place and take it out from the other and still keep that argument going.
Yeah, I'm not too bothered about the tuition fee rise, because I think it's covered in loan. You get loans for it anyway, and I'm assuming most people actually won't pay back what they borrow.
That shouldn't be the motivation, right? It shouldn't be a motivation to say, I don't mind, I don't pay it back anyway.
Yeah.
On the grand scheme, the system can't work.
I think in theory the idea is fair. The idea that in order to provide good education and in order to provide the resources needed for education, that the cost does have to rise in order to keep our universities competitive with those around the world. We already have a world-class university system, but if we do not raise funding, and if we do not allow the burden of paying for education through taxes to rest on the shoulders of all members of society, including those taking places at university, instead of increasing taxation for other members who aren't necessarily affiliated with anybody going to university, then I think it's fair.
I think that the thing about tuition fees is that they're rising at the same time as there are big education cuts, and while education is being cut from government funding, teaching funding, for a start, the rise in tuition fees isn't enough to stop that gap. In addition to that, in terms of the academic credibility of universities in this country as opposed to other countries, because of the cuts in teaching grants from the government, what's going to happen is that they're going to be forced redundancies. We've already seen them at places such as the University of Birmingham. And once you lose those members of staff when you cut those departments, the academic reputation of the university is going to go down, and the credibility of those departments is going to go down. And on the world platform, it's much harder to bring back that reputation than to just scrap it. The other thing as well is that this idea that raising tuition fees is going to sort of take the burden away from the government is a bit of a myth, because whatever student loans, the student loan company essentially funded by the government, while they're having to pay more, essentially the government are going to have to dish out that £9,000 a year per student anyway. And so, to say, well, we get a loan, that's still being borrowed from the government is still spending on that.
And the other thing as well, the demand of a person to go to university.
And the money, in the end of the day, they're going to get the money back.
Well, the other thing as well, that just to mention on John's point, is that tuition fees might rise, but then so will the loan, is that really underestimates what it means to a lot of working class kids going to university, because I think the thing that we have that's particularly different in this country, I'd like to think, as opposed to say America, is that there's much more social mobility, particularly where education is concerned.
That's true, yeah.
And while education post-16 isn't a codified right, it's not written down anywhere, I think that the concept of education, as Anoush said, you can't really put a price on that. And I think that the issue here is that it's all very well for the government to turn around and say, well, we're going to do this and it's the right thing and blah blah blah. But for someone who's from a family where that level of debt to come out of a degree after 3 years and suddenly have so much debt, and it's not just the tuition fees, it's not just the £27,000,
It's your maintenance.
cost
Yes.
as well, of course. And so the concept of that debt, no matter what rate you're paying back at, is still a burden around your neck, and it's much too big for a lot of people to even comprehend. And in that way, that's how it prices people out of education, leaves it in the domain of the rich.
I think it's bad how like all the changes, rather than being like they've been like marketed as being to cut the deficit, but they're actually going to cost the government money in the short term, and they're purely ideological changes rather than like in any way pragmatical.
Yeah, completely.
No, I disagree. I think faced with the situation that we have, I don't think that these cuts are ideologically motivated. I think the problem is that there's this attitude that has been had in the past that public services have been infallible, and that money which has been given to public services, as it was under New Labour, where government departments rather happily guzzled money, and it is as if we're saying all the money that was spent during the past 13 years has gone to exactly where it needs to be, that there is no waste within spending, and that every penny has been spent wisely, when it's not the case, that schemes have failed, money has been poorly invested. And we're faced with a situation now where education has been given a rather bloated budget and has got accustomed to spending a budget in a way that can be considered quite unwise. And in a way, it's like taking an addict off of a drug. To wean down the amount of the drug that the addict has got is hard. But it's ultimately worthwhile in that the system will, hopefully, the hope is, become more streamlined as a result of it.
I completely agree with you that, government agencies have become far too bloated under New Labour. And there's a lot of
in
bureaucracy
times of
involved.
good, no one looks at
Yeah.
these things. You say, I need £1 million for this. Fine, you can
Go
take
for it,
that.
have
Yeah.
what money you want. But
Have
I
a
mean,
million.
but I completely agree with you that Whitehall has grown, that we have all these management teams and sort of success assessment teams, and they're all managerial teams around. Not just in Whitehall,
The
but in
size of
individual universities as well.
Government has grown, definitely.
But if you cut
Much
the
to the scorn of
funding,
the
if you cut the
Conservatives.
funding, the bureaucrats aren't going to cut funding for their own departments. They're going to cut funding from things like actual teaching or library maintenance. So we're going to have, for instance, fewer books. We're going to have much larger
It's a
classes.
fair point.
We're going to
It's a fair
have
point, yeah.
fewer lectures. We're going to have less choice for the modules that we can take. So if next year I want to take something on, international political economy, I'm not going to be able to take it because there isn't the funding for it.
It's a fair point.
And that's how it's. I mean, if they were targeting the cuts much more specifically at these sort of useless, fluffy
But
bureaucratic
it's won't be the way.
systems, then it would be fine. But they're not. It's just a blunt cut in the overall funding.
Yes, with my query with education cuts is that it's almost like taking a blowtorch to butter instead of taking a scalpel to a patient.
Yeah.
That's my worry.